Our Great and Glorious God, by Jonathan Edwards. Chapter 3. The Grace of God. And he shall bring forth the headstone thereof with shouting, crying, Grace, grace. Zechariah 4 verse 7. The mercy of God is that attribute which we, the fallen sinful race of Adam, stand in greatest need of. And God has been pleased, according to our needs, more gloriously to manifest this attribute than any other. The wonders of divine grace are the greatest of all wonders. The wonders of divine power and wisdom in the making of this great world are marvelous. Other wonders of his justice in punishing sin are wonderful. Many wonderful things have happened since the creation of the world, but none like the wonders of grace. Grace, grace is the sound that the gospel rings with. Grace, grace will be that shout which will ring in heaven forever. What the angels sang at the birth of Christ, of God's good will towards men, is perhaps the highest theme that ever they entered upon. In order to understand the words of our text, notice that the scope and design of the chapter is to comfort and encourage the children of Israel, returned out of their Babylonish captivity in the building of Jerusalem and the temple. It seems that they were very much disheartened because of the opposition they met with in the work, and the lack of the external glory of the former temple before the captivity, so that the priests and the Levites and the chief of the fathers wept aloud as the rest shouted at the sight. This you may see in Ezra 3:12, quote, But many of the priests and Levites and the chief of the fathers, who were ancient men, that had seen the first house, when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy. Unquote. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah were sent on this occasion to comfort them under those discouragements, by foretelling that the glories of the gospel should be displayed in this latter house, which should render the glories of it far beyond the glories of the former, notwithstanding it was so far exceeded in what is external. Haggai chapter 2 verses 3 through 9, quote, Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory, and how do ye see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing? Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord, and be ye strong, O Joshua, son of Josedech, the high priest, and be ye strong, all ye people of the land, saith the Lord, and work, for I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts, according to the word that I covenanted with you when ye came out of Egypt. So my spirit remaineth among you. Fear ye not, for thus saith the Lord of hosts, Yet once, it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens, and the earth, and the sea, and the dry land. And I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. Unquote. See also in the 3rd chapter of Zechariah and verse 8, quote, Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, thou and thy fellows that sit before thee, for they are men wondered at. For behold, I will bring forth my servant, the branch. Unquote. And the same subject is continued in this chapter, even the glorious grace of the gospel, which was to be manifested by Christ in his temple, particularly in our text. Quote, And they shall bring forth the headstone, with shouting, crying, Grace, grace unto it. Unquote. The headstone is that which entirely crowns and finishes the whole work, signifying that the entire gospel dispensation was to be finished in mere grace. This stone was to be brought with repeated shoutings or rejoicings at the grace of God, signifying the admirableness and gloriousness of this grace. Doctrine. The gospel dispensation is finished wholly and entirely in free and glorious grace. Glorious grace shines in every part of the work of redemption. The foundation is laid in grace, the superstructure is reared in grace, and the whole is finished in glorious grace. If Adam had stood and persevered in obedience, he would have been made happy by mere bounty and goodness, for God was not obliged to reward Adam for his perfect obedience any otherwise than by covenant. For Adam, by standing, would not have merited happiness. But this grace would not have been such as the grace of the gospel, for he would have been saved upon the account of what he himself did. But the salvation of the gospel is given altogether freely. Romans chapter 11 verse 6, quote, "And if by grace, then it is no more works. Otherwise grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise work is no more work." End quote. That I may give you as a full explication of this doctrine as I can in a little space, I shall first show that free grace shines forth in the distinct parts of this wondrous work of redemption. Second, I shall speak a little of the gloriousness of this grace. First, every part of this work was performed of mere grace. It was of free grace that God had any thoughts or designs of rescuing mankind after the fall. If there had not been an immense fountain of goodness in God, he would never have entertained any thoughts at all of ever redeeming us after our defection. Man was happy enough at first, and might have continued so to all eternity. If he would, he was not compelled to fall. If he had not willfully and sinfully rebelled against God, he would never have been driven forth like an unworthy wretch as he was. But although God had been so overflowing in his bounty to him as to make him head over the lower creation and the ruler of other creatures, and had planted a garden on purpose for his delight, and would have fixed him in an eternal happiness only on the reasonable condition of his obeying the easy commands of his Maker, yet, notwithstanding all, he rebelled and turned from God to the devil, out of a wicked ambition of being a god himself. He was not content in that happy state that he was in as man, and so rebelled against God's authority. Now who but a God of boundless grace would not have been provoked after this to leave man as he was, in the miserable state into which he had brought himself by his disobedience, resolving to help him no more, leaving him to himself and to the punishment he had deserved, leaving him in the devil's hands where he had thrown himself, not being contented in the arms of his Creator? Who but one of boundless grace would ever have entertained any thoughts of finding a way for man's recovery? God has no need of us or of our praises. He has enough in himself for himself, and neither needs nor desires any additions of happiness. If he did need the worship of his creatures, he had thousands and thousands of angels, and if he did not have enough, he could create more. Or he could have glorified his justice in man's eternal destruction and ruin, and could have, with infinite ease, created other beings more perfect and glorious than man, eternally to sing his praises. But especially it was of rich and boundless grace that he gave his only Son for our restoration. By our fall we are cast down so low into sin and misery, so deeply plunged into a most miserable and sinful condition, that it may truly be said, although all things are infinitely easy to God with respect to his omnipotency, yet with respect God's holiness and justice, God himself could not redeem us without a great deal of cost. No, not without infinite costs. That is, not without the presence of that which is of infinite worth and value, even the blood of his Son, and properly speaking, the blood of God, in the form of a divine person. This was absolutely necessary in order to our redemption, because there was no other way to satisfying God's justice. When we were alien, it came to this: either we must die eternally, or the Son of God must spill his blood. Either we or God's own Son must suffer God's wrath, one of the two, either miserable worms of the dust that had deserved it, or the glorious, amiable, beautiful, and innocent Son of God. The fall of man brought it to this: it must be determined one way or the other, and it was determined by the strangely free and boundless grace of God that his own Son should die, so that the offending worms might be freed and set at liberty from their punishment, and that justice might make them happy. Here is grace indeed. Well may we shout, "Grace, grace," at this. The heathens used to reckon that an only son slain in sacrifice was the greatest gift that could be offered to the gods. It was what they used sometimes to offer in times of great distress. In some parts of the world it is constantly at this day performed. But we have a stranger thing than that declared to us in the gospel. Not that men sacrificed their only sons to God, but that God gave his only Son to be slain as a sacrifice for man. God once commanded Abraham to offer his only son to him, and perhaps the faith and love of Abraham may be looked upon as wonderful, that he was willing to perform it. There are few who would do it in these days. But if you wonder at that, how wonderful is it that, instead of Abraham's offering his only son to God, God should give his only son to be offered for Abraham, and for every child of Abraham. Certainly you will acknowledge this to be a wonder, not to be paralleled. And besides, God did not do this for his friends, but for enemies and haters of him. He did not do it for loyal subjects, but for rebels. He did not do it for those who were his children, but for the children of the devil. He did not do it for those who were excellent, but for those who were more hateful than toads or vipers. He did not do it for those who could in any way be profitable or advantageous to him, but for those who were so weak that instead of profiting God, they were not able in the least to help themselves.